I have been obsessed with the philosophy of acting. And I think that if you take Luber's framework, a tell of a bad metaphysics is when we are bad actors. Um, why? Because when you throw it in the scope of the story, a character needs a motivation and it needs an intention. It needs something to drive it, right? But then there's bad actors that are trying to act um, like actors, right? They're trying to act, and that's actually the tell sign of a bad actor. When you're trying to act, when you're trying to act like you have a motivation or have an intention. Um, and I think it's interesting, even like ethically speaking, because if you look at all the ethical theories on the table, all of them would be, except virtue ethics, would be bad actors. Um, which is a big claim. It's a big claim for me to throw out. But they would be fundamentally bad actors. And it's only the character element, and I do think there is a split, right? Like this between the problem of subjectivity to me, and I'll take it in Lacanian sense, right? Like split subjectivity. But I think from like an acting perspective, it's the struggles between actor and character, right? Finding that harmonization between actor and characters where we really struggle. Um, I think as like human beings. Again, I'm just like fascinated, like the whole acting philosophy. Do we provoke emotions? How can we evoke emotions? A lot of them say, no, it's about the action. And here's another thing, right? They say if there's a good script, then you can do the emotion if it's a good script, right? So it's like there's some qualifications for one, you shouldn't force any emotion. But if it's a good script, well, you don't really need to do a lot of work for that to happen, right? The other thing is it's the emphasis on the action part. You focus on action. Like if a man's frustrated, you do frustrated actions um instead. You focus more on movement um and so on. And so I'm just like really fascinated with I feel like a lot of good philosophy could come out from the theories of acting theories like Stanislavski and got Meisner. Uh, so I think a lot of I can tell you right now they would not have been fooled by the dualism of the body problem. They would have not have been fooled by that because they understand how acting works. Um, they would not have believed in that at all. Um, so yeah, that's just like some of the ideas that have just been like surfacing in my mind.
I think that's a friggin' fantastic topic, and I love this idea of evidence of bad metaphysics being found in bad acting. And there's also a kind of sense of a good script makes a good actor, good metaphysics will make a good actor, right? That there's some kind of going together there. Well, we've talked about it before. For me, the phenomenology of the artist was ignored by philosophy. Like it wasn't thought. It really wasn't considered in philosophy. There was the artifact, like the artistic creation and what is art, but the literal experience of artistic creation, I felt as if was not taken account for by philosophy. And then also for me, critically, if something is possible in reality, even if it only happens here and there, you have to have a metaphysics that takes account for that. It's like, we used to say, if you ever experience a green cat and you only experience it once in your life, well, green cats exist. And so your definition of cat has to entail it. So likewise, even if the artistic act, the deep phenomenology of the artist is rare, if it can happen at all, then you need a metaphysics to explain how reality can be a place where something like that could occur. And of course, that's where we did the glimpse, the focus on glimpses and glimmers. Um, for me, acting is a very wonderful frame because there's always this emphasis on this idea that philosophy needs some sort of test. And most of the time, the test has been pragmatism. Is it practical? And certainly, that is where we are after G. Moore, Richard Rorty, and all of them. I would say, honestly, the majority of philosophy in the world is still basically neo-pragmatism. A lot of the stuff we talk about or look up online or list, unfortunately, that is not at all the majority of what is being taught. Now, if one is fortunate to end up in a class with William Desmond, like Mr. Andrew Luber, that's a different matter. If you were to end up with Holgate, that's a different matter. But the high majority of philosophy classes are still basically thought experiments and neo-pragmatism and the history of philosophy. And I'll give it to Mr. Parsons here. For me, this idea of the quality of the acting that the metaphysics affords is a lovely critique, a check, a lovely test. I think it is certainly true that a bad metaphysics leads to a bad actor and bad actions. And I think actually what's lovely to think about metaphysics in terms of acting is that it is necessarily not reducible to its immediacy. Like an actor on the stage is not just responding to their immediacy. And then I'll give it to Luber after Mr. Parsons. You are, a great actor is in a place that is a place in a place. They're here and not here. So they're literally getting lost in something that is not present. So it is not reducible to a simple causation. It is a creative act. It's a high order causation that the person is living. And maybe we could almost say the actor becomes a character, maybe. When the actor becomes a character, that's the success. And that's in that moment of self-forgetfulness where they're truly lost in the metaphysics. And one could argue that a metaphysics can't be a good metaphysics if you can't be lost in it, right? If it can't lead to this kind of self-forgetfulness. So to think about acting as perhaps, the philosophy of acting as perhaps the proper test on metaphysics versus pragmatism can be very, very fruitful. And it certainly is something that I concur with. But let me give it to Mr. Parsons and then Mr. Luber. Mr. Parsons, it's a treat to have you, sir.
Hey, yeah, definitely. Thanks. No, you really hit me with that one that we've been stuck in this pragmatic thinking, through everything. But even you're rolling out Holgate or other philosophers that I respect Desmond, but it's like still they still have to contend with like the overarching philosophy of our time. And then just what Javier was bringing up, like that made me think like anything in this acting, that anything that is it's almost like Cadell's talk yesterday, that this problem of immediacy, when we think we have it, this grasp on it, this act, then it's the actor's going to be dead, dry, whatever it is. And the great scripts we all have is when the actor loses themselves. Like, that's the hard thing. Like, what was it, the Joker, when Ledger goes crazy? You know what I'm saying? Terrible that he goes crazy. But we are like traumatized by this type of acting that we all lose ourselves in, and it's a high mark for like acting of that time. But it's like something we treasure too, and like that's what you're saying. This drama's played out in like I think this is like what was it? I always used to love Richard Rohr. He was one of my favorite like mystics guys. But that's what he always said, this in Greek theater, that every actor knew that this persona they had to put on, they had to almost take themselves off and put this on, this persona to go through. But it was in a sense to show like we're all kind of doing that at a time. Like we're all kind of putting on personas and taking them on and putting them off. And that's where I think and so that was what struck me with Javier, was like anything that immediacy, whatever is tucked away or hidden, is always going to come back to traumatize with Lacan, the stuff. And then that really sung to me, like you're saying, this World War II consensus. Like I've really been wrestling with this lately, because you have people going, hey, well, maybe America's all not that great with the CIA and everything after World War II, because we went down these terrible roads. But they're like, well, bringing up all of this trauma of this war with the Soviet Union. And I don't know, it just had me thinking, a lot of streams together, but that was really great. Thanks.
I think those streams need to be thought together, and I really appreciate what you were saying. I think what you're getting at, there's always this sort of contending with this overarching practical, like you're saying in the classroom, like how does this manifest? And I think the suggestion, then I'll give it to Mr. Luber here. The suggestion is that very need of philosophy to respond to pragmatism, perhaps as a result of missing a philosophy of acting. Because that very sort of tension is assuming that ultimately the judge, the kind of justification of everything is going to be in some sort of pragmatic result, some sort of pragmatic outcome. Now, in one sense, it seems very problematic to say that it doesn't have to have a good outcome. But then in another way, it seems very problematic to say it does. So what do? It seems as if we can't think outcome unless we change our heuristic of the quality of the outcome we are looking for. We have to become more intelligent about what outcomes we're looking for, more discerning, more, I suppose, evolved in what is the outcome we are looking for. And I like acting because I'll just say personally, I have always found the idea of, and then I'll give it to Luber here, giving a performance as the proper way to think about life. Like you are engaged in a certain performance. When you are speaking with people, you are creating a space, you are creating a certain performance. Now, the problem is the word performance sounds fake to people. It sounds like you're making something, you're not being authentic. And actually, that in of its very self is a suggestion that we're stuck in a kind of dichotomy. Acting, authentic, one or the other, right? And if you're not being authentic, then it's not real. But then the problem is if people are real, they just throw the real at people and they have talks online that kind of suck or they're boring, or people just get together and they have neighbors over and, there's nothing going on, right? There's a problem with kind of suggesting that, well, just be yourself, right? Well, being yourself may be destructive. And you get in this endless kind of hamster wheel of not knowing what to think, right? You don't know what to do with it. Empty speech. Yes, Mr. Parsons. For me, this suggests a higher understanding of what a word like performance can mean. Like when you interact with another person, it's an event. Like there's something about thinking about encounters as events in this kind of highway that have you brought yourself to the place where you can meet the person in encounter? Are you ready for the event of a gathering, of a stumping, et cetera, so forth, right? And that people are indeed trying to come together with a certain quality of interaction that creates a spirit or a geopedia that otherwise would not be possible. This seems to be a kind of acting, right? But it is an acting that, if done correctly, unlocks something in the nature of reality that is more real than real. This is kind of the funny move. Like, if this acting is done correctly, it actually seems to unleash something in reality that's more real than real, which would, funny enough, suggest that the only way to actually be real is to act, which is very counterintuitive. We think acting gets in the way of reality. Well, maybe it gets in the way of, lowercase r reality, but it actually seems to be key for the unleashing of geopedia, the unleashing of the realist of the real, the beautiful, right? So this trap we're currently in our thinking between authentic or acting in a negative sense, or being real versus being contrived, because there's lots of people, you'll hear people talk all the time about, oh, in these conversations, are we real? Are we actually being honest? Blah, blah, blah. And there's this kind of uncertainty about it. Well, that is all tied to, I think, these problematic goals, like these senses of what the outcomes are supposed to be that are confused. Right? They're not sure what the outcome is supposed to be. Is it supposed to be practical? Is it supposed to be quote unquote real? Or is it supposed to be the unlocking of something in the depths of real? Because the reason why I talk about this unlocking of the geopedia, or the unlocking of this real that's the realist of the real, and actually what humans long for, in my opinion, is great acting does that. Like great art does just that. There is that moment where suddenly, boom. And it's like reality showed up. It's like the Holy Spirit. It's like geopedia. It's like, and boom. Doesn't happen often, but when it happens, You don't really care if people were acting or real or false or authentic. All of those categories of thought go away. You're not asking those questions because you're in it. You're freaking in it. And that seems to be what a philosophy of acting might help us to get at, but more to be said, and would be the test of a good metaphysics, of course, because who cares about a metaphysics that can't do that? Who cares? Mr. Luber, please.
In my opinion, what we're talking about is the subject that's like the actor or the subject that's responding to a good script. So what that means to me is when you read a good script, what happens is it you from your unique perspective, you see an aspect of a character or something within the story that you break it. You there's a split because you're the script you are entering with your unique perspective the script's world, and with that you don't once you break it and you have an insight or a note, as they would say, you you change something that is on the page, but not because you're trying to change it, but because for you to be in it, it's what's required for you to be in it. It's 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 beyond thought. It's the actual meshing of your subjectivity and um the world of the script. And that's why, like, you'll go on Instagram and you'll see, a thing with a movie, and then it has like the script underneath it, and you'll see that sometimes not every line is hit, or that certain lines are performed differently than what's on the page, and yet the sentiment of that scene is still coming through. And the crazy thing about it is that you get another actor to do it, you'll probably get a whole different execution, and yet the same sentiment. And this is where like telos is a very interesting thing, because it's static but not static at the same time. The sentiment is still going to come through, but the actual execution of that is totally not static. It's totally in the encounter of two worlds colliding, basically. And I just want to make a quick distinction. Uh, there's that kind of note where you are basically expanding the vitality of the story, versus the note of this makes no sense to me. Like, this just doesn't, I can't, I'm not encountering something. So there's two different kinds of notes, and every good storyteller ought to strive for the former, which is having something that it makes someone encounter it, and therefore it breaks part of the story. It breaks the story, and it allows space for that subject to have their subjectivity dwell within the world of that story. Now, to relate this to metaphysics is the conversation of consciousness, because well, one, I just watched this little like 27-minute thing with like Wolfram and Joshua Bach on they were doing a panel at the Machine Conscious organization that started up in San Francisco a couple months ago. And this relates directly to this conversation, because basically that conversation is a good way via analogy to understand how to have a metaphysics, a good one for us humans. And I think basically where they are getting wrong is they are looking for a method in which consciousness can be as such, where it's not a method but consciousness is a response to being within being within a mythology, being within an already a given story or mythology that, again, it's the same thing. I'm just drawing an analogy here, where the mythology is creating a space where there's an encounter that the subject that is encountering it is able to break the mythology and is able to then participate in the mythology via split, like there being a split within it that it's able to situate itself in, and therefore it actually, your unique position is actually participating in the vitality and the extension of the mythology itself through the ironic breaking of the mythology. So it's not about creating a method, it's actually about creating a story, creating a mythology that once you run the computer code, so to speak, once it runs, it's operating under a given mythology where it can then encounter it internally. Because here's the crazy thing about it, it's an internal process. Like when I write a script, it's internal, that becomes external via the writing, and then the actor reads it externally, but the actual reading and understanding and the encounter is all internal. So it's two internal systems that are colliding that ultimately break each other, because you can't have an internal consistent system pointing to your book, The Map is Indestructible. And that's why it's you have to understand that there's the necessity of an internal system, like there is that needed, but you need to be able to take a step back and realize that there needs to be an encounter of different internal systems that break each other. And then once you are at that position of looking at the situation and according to that, now you're really talking about systems for real. Like there's the systems encounter to another internal system. And then, in my opinion, the real system making, which is the viewpoint of both systems colliding and breaking and seeing what comes from that breakage, is the actual system, because it accounts for there not being one internal system. Like that's the whole point. And in that sense, you could get into the dialectic of basically how it moves in time. Like that's how time then works, because time works with how internal systems collide and break, and how it moves in time is the actual breakage itself between the two internal systems. And then this is where Desmond's stuff comes in, where it's like it's it's in between how these two systems are working with each other is where the ordering of time exists. There is no so to tie it back basically to the original thing that I was saying, there is no actor without the script. Like that, there is, like there's this great line that Desmond says, where it's basically you can't be self-conscious without the consciousness of another. That that is a very, very powerful sentiment, because basically what that's saying is I can't be an actor without a script, because the script in a certain sense is saying something about my subjectivity, and it's saying it in a way that isn't fully right, and therefore it allows me to encounter it and break it in order for me to actually congeal with the world accordingly. It's a really funny thing where it's basically saying enough to resonate with you, but it's not saying enough to say exactly who you are. It's saying enough for you to then say, okay, for me to participate in this script, this is who I have to become, and therefore it's not a thought, it's just pure action, and this is just what it is for me to be the actor to play this role. Like it's not up for debate. And then the philosophy, so to speak, within that dynamic, and then I'll digress, and I mean I'll stop and pass it off. The philosophy in that dynamic is when you have like the director, you have the director thinking about what they want, and then the actor is like, this is what I can be. So you have desire meeting what is actually capable in the actor. Like the desire might not be able to, like the capability of the actor might not be able to meet the desire of the director. Like that is the hard problem, essentially. Um, and the only way to mediate through that is basically having different takes with different like iterations of that take in order to see in the edit which iteration matches the desire of the director in the most possible way. And yeah, I'll just leave it off there. Yeah, this is great so far.
Fantastic. I appreciate Christian. Good to see you. And Michelle, good to see you till the internet cut us off. One day we'll have FiOS. It's going to be great. I believe. I believe. We're talking about the philosophy of acting that Javier brought up, and I think it's a fantastic subject, and how often we think that the kind of test of philosophy is pragmatism, but maybe it's something more like acting, being a good actor. And there's this idea of a good performance, that a sign of a bad metaphysics is bad acting, per se, is what Mr. Rivera said, which I thought was lovely. I really appreciate everything you're saying there, Mr. Luber. There is absolutely something about where the real test is at the girdle point of an internally consistent system, where the map breaks, but it breaks in its consistency. It's not that there's any mistake in the map, it's precisely in its perfection that unveils it can't be reality, because otherwise it'd be excessive and overwhelm you. So it's when a map achieves internal consistency, that very consistent means it can't correspond with reality, because reality is open or excessive, right? So if you have a perfect map, then it must be right. Then it must be wrong is the weird move, right? But that wrongness is only going to be possible with the subject aware of this in the encounter of the internal consistency, who goes, well, this can't be the case. So they're conscious of something that is not given in their immediacy. They go, this isn't right. That's very mysterious. And it makes me think of what you were saying about the note, and then I'll give it to Mr. Rivera. It is very odd when an actor is reading a script and they get to a point where they say, this character wouldn't say that. What? What do you mean? What do you mean the character wouldn't say that? And they know it, and they're right. They're friggin' right. Well, that doesn't make sense. Like, you get to this place where you go, the character wouldn't say that, right? Like, how do you get to this place where you know the character? Mr. Eber, good to see you, sir. We've been talking a bit on the philosophy of acting. And this idea of, like, someone just knows this isn't right. And how do they get to that place? Or I'll have that experience in a short story where you go, Mary Rose wouldn't say this. How is that the case, right? There's nothing there's no grammatical mistake. There's nothing in the line of dialogue that means this can't be the case, and yet you know this is not so, right? Well, likewise, that idea of a good metaphysics kind of being like, it can't be good if it doesn't give rise to a certain performance, if it doesn't give rise to a certain way of holding of the person. And it moves at that point to kind of that Bergsonian intuition, where you have this kind of intuition that this is not correct, right? And what's very interesting is that sense that this is not correct, and it could apply to music, it could apply to different things, it could apply to spaces, relationships, is interesting because it's a kind of pragmatic critique, and yet it seems very different from there is no running water. When the actor gets to the place where they say the character wouldn't say this, or this is not believable, or they get a sense that we need to kind of change the dialogue a little bit and they miss a dialogue and it's fitting, like, this is a kind of pragmatism, but it is also not the same as most classical understandings of pragmatism. So what is going on there? I think what you were saying about consciousness there, Mr. Liu, I think about resituating with the RE in parentheses, like this motion of breaking and knitting. So you're breaking it, but you're knitting it together in line, as you said, with the sentiment, right? Or you're breaking, it's a both breaking and knitting at the same time, according to this kind of higher order logic, that then you say, well, this is proper, right? The dialogue, you read this isn't right, so you break the dialogue on the page and you knit it together in a manner that is more aligned with the kind of character, a resituating with the RE in parentheses. And there is something very interesting about how that seems to be when we're really thinking, when we're engaged in this act of resituating, as opposed to just trying to create a method, which the funny thing is, if you achieved a quote unquote method of consciousness, to use what you were saying on that talk, oddly, the method would be precisely as Mr. Ebers talked about, the point where you don't have to think anymore. You're saving energy. You kind of go into a certain sleep, right? Which then, funny enough, could be evidence to you that this method must be correct. Because then, look, it just follows it. It unfolds properly. But actually, it is because it's not conscious. It's not open. It's just following through the methodology. So I think that all points to a lot. And I like what you were saying about the note. And also this idea of the same sentiment, yet different execution that we can see in acting, I think speaks to the possibility of the universal and the singular, which is, of course, the crown jewel of thinking, the political, the economic problem today in global pluralism. This idea of how do you have a universal and yet maintain singularity and difference at the same time. Well, this idea of same sentiment, yet different execution is very interesting, which ties to a certain Bergsonian intuition, which would align with good acting that thus affords good metaphysics, seems to be part of that puzzle. But I will pause and I will give it to Mr. Rivera and then Christian. Mr. Rivera, please.
Yeah, I mean, something that Luber and I have talked to before about, so there's something about the story metaphysics that is hard to attach to human experience. Like it's like it, but not like it, right? Like there's like we feel like characters, and that's when I started thinking more about like, oh well, actually, perhaps our experience is that split between actor and character that would be more analogous to like our experience of like a story. And that like started to make more sense to me because there was something that didn't quite fit that I was a character in a story, but then at the same time it felt true that I was a character in a story. But then there was something that was a little bit other to that, and so acting made sense to me. The other thing that you said, Luber, it's basically, I remember Matthew McConaughey said this in an interview about scripts. He said most people think you just have to, just about memorizing the script. For Matthew McConaughey, it's more about, no, you have to understand the situation, which I thought was interesting. He said that. You have to understand the situation. You have to understand what does the character want. Because you could say what the script says with just your face. That's what Matthew McConaughey says. He's like, I could do it non-verbally, and I get across the sentiment. Yes, exactly. I get across the sentiment without even saying the lines, right? So that means that it's not just about memorizing the script. It's about this kind of deep understanding of what the character wants, what he desires, what's preventing him from getting what he wants. And then you're able to act, right? The other thing that I that I found interesting is I think Viola Davis says something really funny. She goes, the actors that deserve awards are the ones that had to make bad scripts look good. That's that really stood out to me because that means that the actor is actually going overtime to compensate for a bad script. But when the script is really good, there seems to be like this creative dialogue that's coming out between the actor and the director that they want it to happen. And I recently posted this. It's funny, Danny, you were talking about, when the actor disagrees with the director. Recently, there's a clip of James Gunn and David Corn Sweat debating about on the set of Superman about how the character, he's like, I feel like the character would say this, the director's totally disagreeing with him, right? What I thought was interesting just about this was that this is the first time that you can have like a philosophical debate because they're so invested in it, right? That's what I thought was interesting, is that actor-director relationship, they're both creators, but they're coming from at it from different angles. And yet they're able to have this debate and this conversation because they feel like they both really care about the stakes of this story and what the character wants. And I feel like there's something philosophically interesting there with this kind of participation element. I mean, I imagine it's not too different from music creating and all that stuff. But specifically this kind of participation, that's dialogue that is evoked from, talking about what a character wants, how a character would act, how a character understands something or not understands something. It's a very interesting way to speak versus saying how I should speak or how you should speak. The very interesting in that sense. The other thing that I've been thinking of in relation to this is the metaphysical difference between movie making and plays. And the reason why I feel like there's something there with that is precisely what Luber brought up with this idea of cutting. Plays don't do cuts. Plays expose the whole body. Movie making works on angles. Now, Ian McKellen pointed this out to me about plays. He says, the actor in a movie could perhaps get away with not having to deal with his whole body because you can just deal with the shot and angle of the camera. He goes, but when you're in a play, there's this constant nagging question because the audience sees your whole body, which is, what do I do with my hands? Right? What do I do with my feet? Because the audience sees your entire body. And so you have to have this masterful harmony between your acting and your body in a kind of total sense. Now I've heard arguments that, people, know that plays are fake versus movies. So that's why, it's very interesting. But I feel like there's something metaphysically there between this difference between cutting, the full body experience that you have in plays, what that entails. Yeah.
I think that's very interesting on cuts, whole body angles. I had not thought of that. That is very interesting how in the play, the entire body is present all the time. That seems quite fruitful to think. And I like also what you're explaining on the Superman set, and then I'll give it to Christian, and if anyone wants to speak on this idea of when they say Superman, I feel like Superman would say this, right? But what are they arguing for? Like, what is the thing that you're arguing for, right? It's almost like this idea of if the character doesn't say this, the audience is going to be pulled out of the kind of trance of the film. Like they're going to be pulled out of it. James Wood always, I love what he said in literature. He said, a key to literature is it always maintains the trance of believability. Like you forget your reading, which is very odd, right? Because there's this weird thing where there seems to be a problematic thoughtlessness, but then there's seemingly this kind of higher order unconsciousness that actually is the goal of art, which is, thinking about what we've talked about before of consciousness and as Ebert has stressed. And it's just very interesting to think that there's some sort of effort to create unconsciousness, which it's funny because it's like there's a problematic thoughtlessness of going through life that could lead to a banality of evil. But on the other side of the art project, there's almost this higher order sort of trance of believability that actually then speaks to a certain sort of, thing that people are craving in a certain way, or it has this effect on people. And Clayton, thank you for being here, sir. So it's very, very interesting when there's this idea of having an argument of, I feel like the character would say this or not. And there can also be this very interesting tension of where, if you have 99.9% lines of dialogue or scenes that work, but one of them breaks the trance of believability, it's almost like it ruins the whole thing because you lose. Like it kind of breaks through the entire thing. I mean, I certainly, there is that tension of like, as you're writing a sentence, like it has to maintain the flow. It's not merely the grammar. Like if there's a grammar mistake, then they can be pulled out. But then there's also the verbiage, the flow, the image. It's like, wait a minute, if she fell this way on the river, she couldn't turn over that way. Wait a minute. And then boom, it's kind of broke, right? But that sort of argument of the maintaining of this trance of believability, this kind of space that is one in, it is interesting to think that if a hope of metaphysics, of a sign of a good metaphysics, as you put it, Mr. Rivera, is precisely the possibility of a trance of believability, if I just use that James Wood phrase, um, and that the ethics, the good acting would be that of which actually realizes that potential in the metaphysics, right? So bad acting could be evidence of either a bad script, ergo a metaphysics that doesn't have this potential of the trance of believability in it, or it could be evidence that the individual hasn't figured out, they haven't become the character properly, right? And it's interesting to think that both are needed. But this is a much more high order ethical structure, dare I say, than simply do's and don'ts. Because if I tell an actor, like, it's hard to imagine a great actor emerging from only the do's and don'ts. There's also a certain sentiment that has to be maintained. And a certain intuition that has to be maintained as well, as I think Mr. Luber was getting at. But it is, the other thing and then I'll give it to Christian here. I mean, the other thing I'm thinking about with a play certainly seems to be more of a continual shot. It's a continual shot as well. It's not going to be cutting as much. So there's this certain sort of like, you really have to become the character. Now, of course, you may go off the scene, but the idea of the continual shot is also interesting to think in this context. But I will pause and give it to Christian and then Mr. Ebert. So, Christian, thank you for being here, sir.
This play thing. I like this sentiment about the symmetries between someone's metaphysics and their actions, so to speak. And it's hard, I think, to fully divorce that from an idea of pragmatism, depending on how you want to hold the idea of pragmatism. There's different ways to hold that word. So I think I've brought this up before, but the rich, never-ending well of spiritual metaphors in India includes a very prominent one in Shiva and Shakti and their play together, which is called Leela. And I think it's interesting that some people are very comfortable with just holding that kind of triplicate notion of, and you can like apply it to almost anything where you might identify a triple, but this may be most fundamental triple of consciousness and possibility and the play between the two. That's just like, there's three things, and it's kind of one big thing, but it's also definitely three things. You need two things to interact. The interaction is a third thing, blah, blah, blah. And as I'm like going on my philosophical journey over the last couple months, more on the Western side of philosophy, I am noticing, I think, a tendency in Western philosophy to always have one of the three things subsume the others. Either by one degree where you end up with a duality, or by another degree by which you end up with a monism of some kind. I find this interesting. Like Plato, there's a great quote I recently read from William James, which I won't know verbatim, but it's basically all of philosophy comes down to like a difference of people's attitudes about things, which I think is so true. Because once it gets to these very hard, abstract and metaphysical questions, so much of it is just like aesthetic choice, basically. I was just reading Chalmers on consciousness, and he's like, I kind of think proto-panpsychism is the best option here, but I can't tell you why. It's just like an aesthetic feeling I have. It's like, all right, yeah. I mean, at least some people will own up to this. But it seems to me there's like an aesthetic tendency in Western philosophy towards this collapse of the triple into a double. And Plato says something interesting in Timaeus, where he talks about how there must always be a third. And he's talking about it in the context of like how things join together. He's like, all right, you have this thing, you have this thing. There, in order for them to relate to each other, there must be a third thing. But he has a leaning toward perfect joining, where they get kind of subsumed into a singular thing. I don't know if I have my notes up. Yeah. He says there must be some bond of union between them, and the fairest bond, the fairest, who says what's fair? I guess Plato does. The fairest bond is that which makes the most complete fusion of itself and the things which it combines. And then he says that proportion, in kind of speaking of like forms, proportion is the best adapted to effect such a union. And I noticed an interesting thing there, because like once you start to talk about proportion, you're moving away from pure relationality into something that has its own objective kind of identity. It becomes a relata more than a relation. Or in Plato's case, it's like proportion, kind of relationality becomes proportionality. And it's like the interaction between the two things is like how they measure themselves. And then it all becomes kind of one thing in this landing on the idea of proportions, where this is, well, how do I know that proportion is what to that, blah, blah, blah. And I think that's, I don't know, it just seems like, to use William James's thing, it's like an attitudinal disposition that I think I see a lot in the Western philosophy I've been studying, is like, what's the way that this all comes together into a singularity, or some single whatever worldview, metaphysics, substance, blah blah blah. Whereas Shiva, Shakti, and Leela, it's just like it's the three of them. And I think, the difference, one way to talk about the difference is like in Shiva, Shakti, and Leela, the play is not proportional. Leela but it doesn't mean it doesn't have a certain character to it. It just means that character is not proportional. So one way to like really simply understand this, I think, is like if you have like two, let's use the visual metaphor. You have black and you have white, and then you have the dimensionless line between the two. On the one hand, that line has a form, it has a shape, right? But it does not have proportion. It's just like you can't draw, I mean, you can draw a circle around it, but not without including the black and the white, right? You can't draw a circle just around the line. That's impossible. Once you start trying to do that, you're moving into proportionality, and you're trying to, like, again, just draw a circle and say it's one thing. And so that difference between what you might call a pure contour, visually speaking, and a proportional shape, I think is the difference in the attitude. Like, can we be comfortable with relationality being more of a contour, more of a pure meeting that does not have its own proportion, rather than trying to turn it into a proportionality? And so I think in a kind of egoic way, and this comes, a bit more to like our sense of our personality, or like when our pragmatism gets captured by our sense of personal narrative and achievement and stuff. But Aristotle came to like a similar conclusion about this triplicate nature. He used slightly different words. He had form and matter and what is that word? Steresis. And he says this is different than Plato's third thing, hora, which is the pure potentiality, shakti. He says no, and he even though Plato describes hora, well, he says it's hard to describe. It's this like retainer, or a receptacle, it's emptiness. It's hard to put it into words. You get to it by bastard reckoning. Aristotle says a lot of the same things about steresis, a little different, but then he tries to like distinguish his thought from Plato's by saying, and he said this isn't verbatim, but he says, despite what Plato wrote, and these kind of like queer way that he tried to describe Quora, he just meant place. And in his spoken teachings, you would know this. He didn't really forget that. Now, let me introduce steresis. What is steresis? It's pure potentiality. It's what has not yet become, but which is, within that which can become it. And he specifically says matter is a substance. Steresis is not a substance. He describes it in almost the exact same way as Plato describes hora, but then he like kind of misrepresents hora in order to distinguish his own thought from it. And I think, and he does make a little difference in a way that I think is like a not a great move, because it leaves us in a place that creates more questions and answers about what steresis means. Because, well, I'll put that to the side, but I think that also speaks to another thread I see in Western philosophy, which is people's sense of identity with their body of work, their thought, right? They want to be able to say, this is my work and that's yours. Or if it's your work, I have to make sure to give you credit, right? And there's so much of that in Western philosophy where it's a constant reference game of so-and-so and Heidegger and this person and blah, blah, blah. And there's this emphasis on who thought belongs to, where in Eastern thought you don't see that so much. It's like the entities that you appeal to are more like these metaphorical godlike entities that just represent the ideas, and they're the cards on the table and anyone can play with them. Whereas it's quite different. There's more like a lineage and accurate. You have to credit people in Western philosophy, because I conceptualize this in kind of a romantic, transcendental way of Aeonism, where we kind of make ourselves into to gods, where it's like what's pragmatic, what even if it's not said, what's like kind of implicitly pragmatic is my ability to create something, to transform, to build something. And there wasn't something there before, now I have an explanation, it's my shiny philosophy, blah blah blah. And so like pragmatism implicitly gets tied to like, what can I do, and in terms of building conceptions of reality. So how do I end this? I'll end it with something you bring up a lot, which Daniel, which is pluralism. And so here's like, and I'll categorize pluralism as like a subspecies of irrealism or nominalism, or they're all kind of hang together, where it's like, when you build a metaphysics, when you build a worldview, that's just a story. All right. It doesn't represent the world. You have just created a world, and that guy created a world, and that girl created, and right. And so we're all carrying these worlds around, and it's that no one's talking about the world. And so let's just like hold some space for everybody's worlds and try to, understand your world a little bit better. You'll understand my world a little bit better. And we're not going to play the game of trying to subsume everybody's world into a singular objective world view. But the why pluralism you might say pragmatically is necessary but insufficient is that, well, it does one of two things. It kind of sneaks in its own worldview. That's about pragmaticism itself, and like, all right, well, why are we doing that? Why are we playing the game of pluralism? And then what you'll find is some appeal to some normative ethics, right? Well, if we don't do that, first of all, it's like, monism is broken, so you're going to run into mistakes. And so pragmatically speaking, we can't play that game, so we have to play the pluralistic game. But why? For what end? What's the pragmatic value? And then that's when monism gets snuck back in as like kind of an ethical worldview where you make decisions about what's good and bad and etc. And then you have to exclude, then you don't get to be completely pluralistic because now you're excluding ethical views that disagree with your disposition, right? And you tend to like want to build some ethical framework that is absolute and says this is good but this is less good and this is more pragmatic and this is less pragmatic. But pragmatism itself, again, is a view that you can get locked into. So I think, you know, pluralism in that regard is necessary but insufficient unless you allow it to eat itself in a certain way and say, well, I have to admit I'm taking a worldview here. What happens when I don't do that? Is there kind of a plurality between plurality and monism? To me, this has always been a deep tension in my thought, right? It's kind of like, you know, what's the famous phrase about like, you can't tolerate intolerance, right? It's like, oh, well, now we have this weird tolerance and intolerance friction. And for me, what I'm working towards right now is like the next move is what I'm calling aporism, which is just like a very deep humility that says, I don't know. And so what guides you at that point, I think, and I keep coming back to this, is just love. And that's a hard thing to draw a circle around. So anyways, that's a good enough place to stop.
Well, thank you for sharing that, Christian. Then if anyone wants to speak, there is something very interesting. So there's a few things. First, there is something where many sociologists warn that many people's decisions are based on aesthetics. They think they're based on rationality, but it's actually aesthetics. And this can actually be oppressive because people can say that doesn't look middle class, therefore isn't middle class, therefore get it out of my neighborhood. Like people like, many like distinctions, like that famous book, Distinctions, talking about how ruling class in the past had to create an aesthetic that looked like a ruling class. Otherwise, people would go, well, they look like me, so why do they have all the money and power, right? And actually, funny enough, stuff like table manners, like these super complicated table manners, are actually designed where the lower classes say, well, I don't want to have to do all that when I sit down to eat, so they can be rich and I won't be. Where then all of the etiquette, all of the aesthetics, all of the appeal are also part of a certain legitimization of class structure, is what many sociologists will argue. And actually, one of the things they argue is one of the reasons why it's very foolish if the CEO starts wearing blue jeans and a t-shirt just like everyone else, because if the CEOs who are super rich start looking like everyone else, and people go, well, why are they so much richer than me if they look the same, right? And this all works on a subconscious level, but it's just very, very interesting how aesthetics actually go a long way toward maintaining or ruining the social order. But then what's very interesting is aesthetics and performance and acting kind of go together, because also the ruling classes were performing in a certain aesthetic that created a certain sort of metaphysics that said, we're supposed to have money and you're not. You could say it's an essentialistic metaphysics and it was very bad, but it also is funny to think that this kind of action, of which then people had the outfits and the costumes and was kind of dressed, suggested the reality of a metaphysics, which is, maybe divine rule of kings or something like that, right? So the aesthetic question, I think, is strongly tied. And then, I think someone like Whitehead is basically like, yeah, most philosophy is aesthetic. It's an aesthetic choice, right? But then the sociologists warn that aesthetics are sources of oppression. So then you need to get good at aesthetics. You need to be aware of the aesthetics you're appealed to. And, that's a big deal. Which actually, for me, gets into why the distinctions, Jacques will talk about beauty as the strike of beauty versus this stable state beauty that becomes an aesthetic that becomes totalitarian. Like, what's the difference? Like, in that book, we have a book called The Fate of Beauty. And basically, there's going to be a lot of argument that if we don't get straight on beauty as a strike, then people are going to think of it as an aesthetic, and it's going to end up in something like Nazism again. Because, Nazism's very aesthetic. It's very, so we've like the fate of beauty The understanding of the concept of beauty is strongly tied to the fate of us, per se. Because if we don't see it as this strike, as this penny drop, as this knitting, this thing that breaks through where the actor kind of understand that moment when the script is done in such a way that the audience is pulled into the trance of believability or pulled into the geopathic. If we don't think of the beautiful that way, then people are going to still want the beautiful, and they're going to end up in Nazism or problematic belonging and et cetera and so forth. So it's very interesting that you could argue, if this is so, and I'll give it to Mr. Rivera there, that there actually is a kind of ethical imperative to get all this stuff on acting and correct. Because if acting is done properly and it's actually pointing toward this strike of beauty, then it's helping people resist an understanding of the beautiful that falls into the aesthetic and totalitarian. Like holding spaces that have the effect of these strikes and these sort of glimmers become really ethically important, because otherwise people still have the hunger for the beautiful or higher things, and so they're going to get captured. So perhaps that kind of points toward the philosophy of acting might point toward a certain ethical necessity to get all of this correct. I really appreciate it. I'll have to think more on it. You're making a very interesting point, how in the East, you're correct, in the Ramayana, the Upanishads, and Mahabharata, you don't see this, Plato said, Whitehead said, it's more of an appeal to metaphysical entities. That's a very interesting insight I will have to ponder, because it does suggest a certain, the idea is in the fabric of things, dang it. You know, it's in the being of things, as opposed to an individual. That's very, very interesting. I'm also thinking about the proportion issue and that invisible sort of part where the black and the white kind of merge. It's very interesting because I think to me that is suggesting why proportion has to serve the mean, which is also serving lack, not mean serve the proportion. Because like the mean, like you need proportion precisely to give you that place where the transition between black and white occurs. And the mean is precisely that there and not there line that's lacking. It's present and absent at the same time. And a whole lot of, it would seem, higher order thinking, to use a large phrase, is actually focusing on that lack, that presence and absence, that needs proportion to be there, because if there's not a proportion between the colors, you don't get that effect per se. But the proportion is serving the mystery of the mean and the lack, not lack for the proportion, right? You're doing proportion to set something up that is evasive, something that's there. Because if you overstress the proportion, well, then it's just a shape. You know, it's just an aesthetic. It's aesthetics on the side of a stable state versus aesthetics serving the strike, serving the lack, serving the thing that's there and not there at the same time. Which then I think is pointing to this proper understanding of acting. That is actually, it is all serving this mysterious moment of the trance of believability where you're pulled in and it works and it occurs. There was something else. Well, I was also going to say, and then I'll stop and give it to Mr. Rivera. The ethics of acting as such seem to me to have something to do with the problem of pluralism. Because right now, what you've got is this problem of pluralism. Yeah, we tried to deal with pluralism with a pragmatism. By saying everyone is practical, so you can have your different worldviews, you can have your different beliefs, but if we're all practical, then we'll come together, right? Or if we all are good capitalists, we'll come together. But of course, it's not so simple. And Aspasia, good to see you. But acting is interesting at a certain basis of the individual, because acting allows an individual to receive a script, be in it and let it go. Be in it and let it go. Be in it and let it go. Like worldviews. You're in it and you let it go. You find the girdle point. You act till you find what I would say the girdle point, and then you let it go for the next script. You work to make the map indestructible, an internally consistent system, and that's precisely the point that points away from it, because no map can be the territory. So if it's internally, the realization of its internal consistency is precisely the realization of its not being the territory in a not just abstract intellectual way, but experientially, where you encounter it. And in that encounter, boom, then you have a successful performance that calls you to another performance, right? This sort of orientation of the individual suggests a perhaps mode that is dealing with this dramatic problem of global pluralism, which is the problem of the one and the many, of course. Like, how do you make a one of a many without destroying the many or not having a one? How do you do it, right? Acting might be an insight into it. The philosophy of acting and the afforded ethics may suggest a certain one in the many, because of course, all of the different people that come together for King Lear are many and different in their backgrounds, and yet one in the performance of King Lear. And the audience is also one with it as well, and they are one in the memory and the one in the emotion and one in the experience. So for me, the phenomenology of the artist, as I've called it, philosophy of acting, etc., so forth, is a key framework by which to think problems of global pluralism, embodied perspective taking, absolutely aspasia. So I appreciate everything that was shared, and I will give it to Mr. Rivera. Mr. Rivera, please.
Again, with like so fascinating about the idea of the script and the actors, like a lot of acting advice talks about listening is probably one of the most important qualities of being an actor. Why? Because if you're thinking about the next thing that you should say in the script, then actually you're not acting. You're not actually being present in the situation in which the actor is talking to you. I've been writing a play myself, and I'm currently writing a play on where I have this dialogue between a therapist and a patient. And I specifically took a psychoanalytic therapist. And the psychoanalytic therapist is actually incredibly more silent than my patient would like. But you can really see the tensions grow between the patient demanding something, wanting something, begging something for the psychoanalyst to say and satisfy their demand. But anyways, this idea of like, yes, so it's funny, right? Because acting's about the script, but then when you act, it can't be about the script, because if it's about the script, then you can't act. Like it's really the thank you, Andrew. And it's just like such an incredible technique and skill that you have to master. With this idea of it's about the script, but it's not about the script when I have to be in the situation about the script. And it's funny because there's a situation where Tom Hanks talks about one of his acting experiences. He goes, in the script, there was, and he looks through the porthole. He goes, well, I was on a boat and there was no porthole. You know? And he was thinking it was going to be the most poetic, you know, scene ever about this character looking through the porthole. And they put him on a boat and there's no porthole. And so he has to kind of still respond. I mean, this is kind of like what Joachim was talking about with like Aristotle, right? There's material necessity, hypothetical necessity that you always have to come in conflict with, even when you're writing a script that the actor still has to work with. But again, I just find it fascinating. And the other thing about plays specifically, so I'm glad you brought this up more, Christian. What I've noticed in Shakespeare's plays versus novels is Shakespeare gives so little stage direction. It's like there's like none. There's like scene. They're in the castle, right? And then like that's it, right? They just have the list of characters. There's so minimal description. There's so much lack in plays, in playwriting. There's so much lack involved that Shakespeare scholars have to debate with each other about, well, is this a sarcastic line? Did Shakespeare mean this in a sarcastic fashion? Did he mean this in a serious fashion? We don't really know. And yet at the same time, I'm thinking, well, isn't this the magic of plays, right? And for the longest time, my naive self was like, why do people watch plays when they've already read the story? And then I realized, oh, it's because you watch the play because you're actually interested in the interpretation of that play. That's why you watch the play. That's why you're willing to watch King Lear like a million different times, because their directors are willing to do it a million different ways. And then I thought, well, that's interesting because we don't have that experience when it's a novel to a movie. We get very dogmatic about novels to movies translations. Why? Because in the script, it says the character looked like this. it says the character did this. And we just rage about the interpretation that the author had. So I think it's just like a very interesting metaphysical conflict when we talk about novels and plays, because plays, I mean, I enjoy novels, but there's something about the way we approach novels that we try to compensate. The novel writing compensates for the lack. You know, the author gives you all the descriptions. He's giving you such rich descriptions about the world, what the characters look like, how the characters are dressed, what the area looks like, and you're just immersed in that world. And then it's hard for you to let go of the movie's director's interpretation of that film, right? You can't even appreciate the movie director's interpretation of that because you're like, that's just not how it even goes. Whereas with the play, well, we don't really have a description like that in Shakespeare. So now I'm curious. I'm interested in how the director, the actors want to use this. I'm interested in how they embody these characters because Shakespeare has given us nothing. Nothing, just dialogue. Dialogue in a setting. And for me, I think there's something about plays that really embody lack. And I feel like, to answer Christian's kind of like concern, I feel like there's something about plays that ironically answer the problem of plurality in that way. It's about becoming this space for plurality, right? By just giving such lack of details. But we need a dialogue. We need something to constrain ourselves towards. But yeah, I'll finish that.
I think that's magnificent. I think what you're saying on this interesting idea of the play can be repeated forever. Like, it's very interesting. If I say, do you want to rewatch a movie versus do you want to see King Lear again? Why is it that the second seems very different from the first? Because different actors, like there are people that go and see King Lear every time it performs. Why? Because it's very different. It's very interesting how the play is a repetition that feels very Deleuzian. Like it's a repetition that always has an excess. Well, with a movie, it doesn't feel so much of an excess. Now, technically, there still is because there's a transformation in the subject, but it's very interesting how rewatching a movie seems more repetitive than rewatching a play, right? And that's very interesting. And because, like you say, there's this difference that is always there. I'll give it to Christian here. A few more things. I think it is critical, like you're pointing out something very important in Shakespeare. There are very few very few stage directions. In my opinion, the great playwrights, which is a loaded phrase, tend to make the stage directions the language itself. Like the language is of such a caliber that you can't imagine the character saying it without a certain move or walking or doing something. The way they're speaking, you can kind of imagine what they were doing to say that dialogue, right? Like if I say to you, how are you, Javier? You would probably need a lot of stage directions. But if I said something to you like, late in the afternoon, isn't it, Javier? Isn't it funny how the second has almost a sense of the way I would say it, how I would be looking at you because of the language, right? Language brings with it direction. And I think the playwright is a revelation of this. And actually, in a very weird sense, I don't think it is by chance that as people have become less refined in language, skilled in language, that they have less direction, that they actually have less direction in life, that there's actually a meaning crisis, because actually the way people use language brings with it, if done well, a certain orientation. One of the reasons why I think basically spaces like this, social coordination mechanism, hip hop, et cetera, so forth, are very important, and why I think the entire education system should be in the business of more language skills than it is because I actually think people's fates and their language use are strongly tied together. Strongly tied together. And their ability to speak is strongly tied to their fate. And the kinds of words they're able to use are strongly tied. Like, one of the number one ways people get enclosed is by a lack of speaking capacity. They get shut down. And obviously, I could make some marital examples or relationships, right? When you read Shakespeare, you see how language itself can entail a certain sense of direction. Not entirely, of course, but it brings with it a certain way of being. Like if I'm thinking of Hamlet walking beside his teacher and he's, brevity is the soul of wit, you just imagine them walking as he's speaking and he's teaching and going like that. You can just see that occurring, right? You don't have to be told that is occurring because the very way the process he's speaking has that sort of way of doing this. When Puck is going through his examples, you have this idea of a certain dancing, a certain laughter, a certain playfulness in his form because of what he is saying, right? I think what has occurred, and this is going to tie into critically this point that actors can't know. They have to act without knowing. That seems impossible unless the words themselves entail the direction. Because then the words lead to the words that lead to the direction, right? And this also points to dealing with the problem of global pluralism, because global pluralism becomes a disaster when people have to know before they act. But if they can act and know at the same time, this starts dealing with the one and the many, because you're responding to the other, not over the other, right? Well, seemingly the quality of speech is tied to this ability to be able to carry yourself in a certain way and have a sense of what actually, brings about certain spaces. Like we all know, to make the point more concrete, we all know that speech creates spaces. If I say to you, I hate you, or why don't you exercise, the what happens? The vibe changes. We all see all the time when how people speak changes the atmosphere and changes how people what? Act, do, like what they're doing. And you can almost feel when people are speaking and it creates a disaster. You're almost like, didn't you know the script? You a-hole, didn't you know the script? There's this kind of appeal to a certain don't you know what you're doing? You're not supposed to do that. How do you know you're not supposed to do that? It's like the actor saying, this isn't what the character would say, right? I know this isn't. Like when you hear people, you're just like, what are you doing? That's not what the kind of direction that is going to emerge from that speaking is not the direction we want to go in. Dang it. And so that logic that we know occurs in couples speaking or anywhere, there's almost a revelation in the great playwrights, like obviously Shakespeare, that will just take that up a notch. Get really good at language, actually, and that does a similar thing at higher order levels, and maybe it even unlocks things like themos and eros and logos. Maybe it unlocks situational thinking if actually people can hold language in a certain way, which of course isn't so far-fetched if humans are language animals, if language and the fate of the human being is so strongly freaking tied together. And I think this also just gets, and then I'll give to Christian, to this $1 million point that if an actor is thinking as they act, they're the centipede. They freeze up. They can't do anything. You have to just know. You just have to tactile knowledge in that Planier way. Many of my favorite epistemological thinkers emphasize this tactile knowledge, this of a Planier or action of a Blondel, right? This ability to know and not know at the same time. This way to reply fittingly to what arises, that even if you know the next line of dialogue, you can't let yourself think the next line of dialogue until it is fitting to think it. So you have to put a timer on the thoughts that you know are supposed to come next. You have to put a certain hesitation, a certain waiting on yourself before you think. And that's how you maintain thought and presence together. This is what we see the actor, and what one could suggest is this actor epistemology, I suppose, basically is increasingly in a complex global pluralistic world is becoming non-optional. It is becoming necessary to function in the world, actually, because the world, by definition, a more unpredictable world is one that will require some kind of actor epistemology. And then what, of course, is very odd, there is a sense in which the great actor kind of makes themselves forget that they know what's going to happen next. Because if they don't have the right emotional response. There's a way in which there's a kind of intentional not think what's next, precisely so you can think it fully when it emerges. Don't let yourself think what's coming next, so that when you think it well. Well, that's entirely counterintuitive. We're taught think it ahead of time so you think it well when it occurs. Well, the actor's like, no, you have to have a certain blinding so that when it comes next, you're in it. That seems very bizarre. But I think it is pointing to the epistemology that seems to be necessary because like Christian was pointing to, there's this way where you need this metaxis, this bothness of ignorance. I don't know, humility, I know and don't know. That seems to be the word, that aphoria, that space of plurality that seems to be necessary for global pluralism. That seems to be the space the good actor occupies. That seems to be what they're able to do, to be in a knowing and not knowing at the same time. That brings a certain humility to the performance. Because here's the other issue. What is the actor humble to? The performance, the unfolding, not just the individual, which of course is not, but it's a human, because we have this question of humility. Well, if everyone was humble to one another, wouldn't that work out? Seems to, but there also seems to be a problem with that, right? Because then what do you do when the sociopath takes advantage of you? Or if you're humble, you never make a decision. There seems to be problems, right? But if you're humble to the unfolding, to the performance, to the creation of the geopadic, the space that bringing forth the strike of beauty, that seems to be a different kind of humility that is also not falling into the passivity where you're ironed out. And honestly, when someone like an A.J. Conyers talks about the difference between tolerance and humility, he wants to argue that humility requires a metaphysic. Like you actually can't even have humility as a distinct activity unless there's a metaphysical dimension to reality, because what's the difference between tolerance or humility? Humility is like, well, there's something beyond us that I have to deal with you for that. And actually, because of that, even though I'm mad at you, you're beautiful even if I don't like it. Somewhere in there is the potential for the strike of beauty, and I have to be humble to that reality that is latent in you that the third points to, quote, quote. So humility basically doesn't make sense without metaphysics. But that humility is the humility of an actor, because they are humble to the unfolding. They're humble to the effect, the trance of believability, and they are serving that. There is something about an actor that is serving that. And there is an entire toolkit of capacities that they are bringing forth in order to serve it well. Because we all know that there are good and bad actors. Well, that would mean there's a way to serve this thing well and to serve it poorly, right? And that sort of difference also seems to be the difference between serving global pluralism, if you will, well, or serving it poorly. Thinking the skills of the actor seem to be, I think basically, and then I'll give it to Christian, basically we are dealing with global pluralism by almost political ethics. Like we're saying, okay, we need political ethics, like democracy or letting people respect the results of the election. There's this kind of, method, a lot like the ethics of a method. We have a method for handling global pluralism. Ergo, it's manifest in the political body, passing of laws, courts, don't murder people, etc., so forth. And basically, we're saying that ethics but that's just saying that ethics is the script. No, it's the full package. It has to be the acting. The script's necessary, but it would be silly to say that a good actor reads a script. They don't freaking read a script. They become a script, dang it. Aspasia, thank you so much. So an emphasis on ethics that is more tied to the philosophy of acting, I think, is very, very fruitful. If we do not do that, phenomenology, the artist, etc., so forth, I think we're in trouble. There's more to be said, but I will pause, and I will give it to Christian. Christian, please.
I just put a link to I don't know if I've brought up the Shags before. They were a band of children by virtue of their father having a dream that his children were going to be a band. So he gave them all musical lessons, and they recorded an album, which the eldest daughter wrote all the songs for. And they are a band that is beloved by music nerds and a lot of musicians too, like Frank Zappa, Kurt Cobain, I think are two different people who said they were like the best band in the world. And they are a terrible band by many classical metrics. The young brother can't keep time on the drums. The compositions are very simple melodic progressions in some sense. The singing is flat. The instruments are not in tune, and if you're looking for certain signifiers of goodness, you will not find them in the Shags. And yet, a lot of people, including myself, you hear it, and boy, something is really coming through that feels very beautiful. And that's interesting to me. I'm trying to figure out how that ties in. it's I think, I don't know, it's like maybe the difference between enjoying a really nice curry and all of its complexity, and then enjoying a simple peanut butter and jelly sandwich that's really poorly made, and the jelly's bleeding through the bread, and there's too much peanut butter, not enough jelly, and it's kind of sticking in your mouth. But it was made with love by your mom. And in that, it makes it an amazing, beautiful experience to eat it no matter what, in terms of its, other aspects, let's say. Um, and with the Shags, I think you can feel the love in their music if you can suspend some amount of intolerance for the lack of a good performance, so to speak. So like to bring it into acting, someone can perfectly memorize their parts and hit their cues on the stage and modulate their voice in just the right way and hit in some certain way all these metrics that they are directed to hit, and it feels completely empty and flat. Okay, so what makes something good then? What's the and I think that a good actor is letting themselves really be subsumed by the perspective of the character that they're taking. So there's a transparency there. There's a lack of pretense in the pretending in some sense, right? And that makes the words that they're saying and the actions that they're taking feel like one in the same with who that actor is in some deep sense at that moment. And now you are feeling an actual connection, and maybe it's that transparency that resonates in you, such that you are now feeling their feelings. And that's a whole other dimensionality to the experience, is the feeling, obviously. So I think that's interesting in terms of like how we speak about what makes something a good performance. There's, and to bring like that to talk about metaphysics in acting, there's maybe a way in which, when we allow ourselves to be actors, in the sense that we kind of cop up to the fact that the ego is a character that is fabricated in some sense, then that allows us to, it allows the felt sense of who we really are, so to speak, come through more. And so if your metaphysics precludes that, if your metaphysics demand that your self be this objective entity, right? And I think we see this a lot in how people approach religious beliefs and whatnot, right? Like, I am a soul that may or may not get salvation or something like this, who is or is not in virtue, who is or is not sinning or whatever, right? And then we have this sense of like a fixed kind of me that has certain statuses that are either yes or no or somewhere on a spectrum, blah, blah, blah. And then I think we see that like that can lead to bad acting, so to speak, because it makes it harder to allow for a kind of natural transformation between one's true self and one's situation and environment. And that's why someone can talk all day about ethics and they can seem like they have a ton of conviction, and yet there's an emptiness, a shallowness to it, which is interesting. I was thinking, when you're talking about like your play, Javier, and this dialogue between a therapist and a patient, it made me think that that's very much like the Socratic dialogues, where Socrates was more like a therapist than he was a rhetorical interlocutor who's just like arguing a position, right? He was, and like your therapist, a lot of times not saying stuff rather than saying stuff, right? Or he was just kind of asking questions like a therapist does rather than giving answers or refuting answers. Um, and this was, led to not the person walking away with a better understanding of the world, but a state of aporia, of puzzlement, blah, blah, blah. And Aristotle said something similar about the mystery rites. Like it's not certain whether he was talking about the Orphic mysteries or the Eleusinian mysteries, but some of these mysterious experiences, whatever, psychedelic perhaps. And he said that you don't go there or he said you shouldn't go there to know something, but to gain a disposition, right? This is something I'm working on a lot, is the difference between positionality and dispositionality. And I think that's what Socrates was helping people do. It's not come to a position on the world, but to become dispositional, which is interesting. And then I would say like aporism is kind of like pure dispositionality, whereas if you were merely pluralistic or merely monistic, we have like 1 foot in positionality and 1 foot in dispositionality, but we're not fully dispositional yet. And and I think you're right that you have to have metaphysics before you can how did you put it? Before you can, I forget what you said, Daniel, but the way I was thinking about it was, Socrates didn't say, I don't know. He said, I know that I do not know, right? It was like an earned not knowingness where you wrestle with metaphysics to ultimately come to a disposition. An interesting person I've been reading a little bit lately is Nikolai Hartmann, who was an early 20th century German philosopher. He's very famous in Germany, not well known outside of it. And I think that's basically because in my opinion, his most interesting contributions were of a purely critical nature. He was not offering positionality. And after what he did was basically like deconstruct positionality and say that once you take metaphysical positions, you create what he calls artificial aporias rather than natural aporias, right? And an artificial aporia might be something like the mind-body problem, the hard problem of consciousness. Well, if I take a physicalist view, now I am left with this seemingly impasse, which is what aporia means, besides meaning puzzlement, it's used in both ways. I'm left at an impasse where I can't explain the link between physical and conscious reality, blah, blah, blah. And he kind of somewhat formalized an argument for why you can't take, why it's a mistake basically to take metaphysical positions, because you end up creating all of these artificial aporias, and you're not necessarily, you can use metaphysical positions to address natural aporias, but once you're kind of committed to that position, you're now committed to a bunch of new artificial aporias that then limit your ability to engage with other natural aporias. Now, what he didn't do was then kind of develop a theory of pragmatism. He then just went into ontology and ended up recreating a lot of Eastern ontologies, which is interesting stuff. And who knows if it was actually useful or pragmatic, but it's interesting. Whereas the other person I've been reading a lot lately, and I'll end here, is Charles Sanders Peirce, who I am just becoming more and more deeply impressed by. I was looking for like a biography or commentary on Peirce, and there isn't one. I'm like, oh, maybe I could write one. I think it would be interesting, but he much more tried to get to the essence of, well, all right, well, what shall our pragmatism be? Or what does that mean? How do we kind of relate pragmatism with the idea of knowing stuff? And he like refined his definition many times, and for a moment there, he was like a bit utilitarian, and then he went back and said, no, that's not right either, blah, blah, blah. It's something more about clarity, but then blah, blah, blah. I haven't read it yet, but he has a work about the evolutionary love, which I'm very interested in since I'm keep coming back to love myself. So I'm really interested to see what he has to say about love and how that ties in. But I think he, well, I guess I'll find out. I guess I'll find out what he has to say about love. But it seemed that at least he was not content merely with criticizing positionality, but then was like, all right, well, what are we doing? What like why are we, what can we say? And I think if you kind of maybe put Pierce and Hartman in dialogue with each other and take from both of their grammars, then you can talk about pragmatism and you can talk about natural and artificial aporias and start to ground metaphysics into love and the kind of, let's say, the natural pragmatisms of love, which is like, maybe let's call it like natural, well, I guess it's hard to talk about the pragmatism of love, but I want to say it's something maybe a bit transcendental in the sense that it's well, I guess, okay, I'll end here. This is another big move that I've been working up in this essay is, and I talked about it a bit the other day when we were talking about non-rational thinking and poetry, but I think maybe at some point we have to submit to the idea that there are commitments we make in life that we can only speak about metaphorically or poetically. We cannot speak about them purely in terms of metaphysical positionality. And that's that. I think that can be hard to come to terms with because it can leave us feeling a bit dissatisfied because that metaphorical commitment to love, let's say, doesn't necessarily solve the natural aporias we commit. It doesn't tell us what to do in a given situation, or like how to solve this problem. It's just more like so this is a good way to put it. The poetry, these metaphors, don't point us in a direction. They rather kind of continuously baptize ourselves to a certain temperament and dispositionality such that we are better equipped to address the natural aporias of life, right? And I think this is ultimately why so many philosophers will come back to something like God, which maybe might not make sense in some metaphysical ontology unless they really try hard to, and then it gets all weird. But at some sense, or for Pierce, love, because love is kind of like a metaphor for something, or maybe it's the essence of metaphor, but it takes humility, I think, to get to that point where you're like saying just something about love and it's metaphorical and I can't put it into words correctly, but it's true and it's beautiful and it's good and we have to surrender to the need for metaphorical orientations, let's say.
No, very well put. And, there's a few things. I'll give it to Mr. Rivera, and if anyone has any final things. So it's very interesting because as you were saying about, first off, it's interesting to think of, is King Lear propositions, right? No, it's like poems. It's like you can't really transfer King Lear in terms of propositions. You have to go and see it and go and see it. But would one say that there is no truth in King Lear? Like that one is not better off and in some way more afforded reality by seeing King Lear than not? That seems incorrect, right? But that means there's some sort of encounter that is possible in King Lear, that thus would be like you're saying, it can only be known in metaphor, it can only be pointed to, etc., so forth, right? Well, I think a great truth of well, many philosophical and religious thinking is that there is that which can only be pointed to. Now, what's very interesting is I am now thinking, as you were speaking, of acting as precisely following the pointing. Like when you're acting, that's where the actor knows what to do because they're following the pointing in reality, or pointing in the scene that is going on, right? They don't need to know what's going to happen next because there's some sort of pointing that is in the environment that is given that they can follow that. The stage direction is in the scene itself, right? In the relation itself. Now, again, that seems like you have to enter a space where I don't know precisely to have the ability to so encounter this, to so be, well, it's a metaxis space, as Mr. Luber would point it. And it's very interesting because as you're saying, like, a poem does not point in a direction, but it continually baptizes. What's interesting to me, because as we were saying earlier, for me, Shakespeare's stage directions is the language itself. It's almost as if when you're baptized in the language, what happens is it changes your character to be attracted to why in the environment. It's not where it gives you direction, it changes your character to be the kind of character who is attracted to the good in the environment that is of a higher quality, I almost want to say, or is the good that is not the artificial aphoria, but it's actually pointing to the natural, right? So it's interesting to think of where it's the language gives direction in changing the character to be attracted to something different. So it's not that the language is top-down giving direction, it is changing you to where you are attracted to doing something else in the scene, attracted to doing something else in the environment. Because in a sense, that's what a good host does, that's what a person does, and what seems to occur is a certain way of speaking to the other, a certain way of engaging, changes what you're attracted to say next, changes how you're going to hold yourself with the person, that then is better than not. And what's interesting is when Socrates is like, and that to me is a gaining of a disposition versus a position. What is occurring is in a higher use of language, the stage direction, the language in Shakespeare gives a disposition to the actors that then makes them attracted to certain movements or ways that are given in the training or afforded by the training of that language. That is a kind of aphoria, because you don't know what is going to occur, but it is not a chaotic aphoria. It is an aphoria where you're letting arise the directionality that your character, as it is afforded by the language, is able to sense, able to Bergson into it, to follow the theme. So instead of the direction being, because then what you're basically saying, but this is why it's inherently metaphysical, because this only is possible if reality itself entails shine. If reality itself entails things that can come forth to attract you. If reality itself, if your scenes entail within them the potential for X to come forth versus Y, based on how you are conditioned, this is the only way this is possible. Well, the very fact that good acting is possible would suggest that it's possible that this is what all of life is, actually. Like, this is the correct way to approach all of life, right? Which I do think is profoundly tied to the language act, but this gets into psychoanalysis, etc., so forth. I'm also thinking about another problem for thinking this, is we tend to think about the self being an actor, like, you know, this idea of people are like, oh, I'm just an actor. I did want to say, before I forget, if there's no such thing as certainty, then there only is disposition. If there is no such thing as certainty, there only is acting. That's the kind of funny thing, right? Like, the only way we're not actors is if certainty is possible. If certainty is not possible, then everyone is, in a sense, acting, necessarily. It's just when you own... So nihilism could actually just open up the philosophy of acting. But the problem is, here's the issue. We think about it, this is the problem though, because we're still overly reifying the ego. We think about, oh, the problem is everyone's an actor for their self-interest. I'm just an actor, so it's for my self-interest. Good actors are not actors for their self-interest. They're actors for the frickin' story, for King Lear, for the environment. The problem is we have not taken the philosophy of an actor and tied it to the geopaic or to a metaphysics. It's tied to self-interest. And therefore, being an actor is about wearing masks to avoid responsibility, to avoid commitment, to avoid getting bogged down. It's the exact opposite of metaphysics, if you will, which metaphysics is a command, if it's anything at all, right? And so the issue is, it's not about acting for self-interest. It's acting so something can be called for, so something can come forth. The geopaic, a certain experience, a quality, like you're saying with the shanks, the shags, which is fantastic because I think that is exactly the made with love. There's a way, because like you're saying, I'll give it to Mr. Rivera and Mr. Luber, and if then anyone has final things, there is a very interesting sense in which what we look for in life is a feeling of something. This will sound cheesy, is, you know, you're describing it's made with love, like your mom made a PJ sandwich and it's not perfect, but it is perfect precisely because it's not perfect, kind of thing. You know, it's made with love. It's kind of like we go through life looking for something that reality made with love. We're like, oh my gosh, reality made this with love. And it's this moment that comes forth of experience. It's like, oh my gosh. And so, like, when you have that geopathic experience, when you have that flow state, when you have that moment of the spirit, the Holy Spirit, etc., how you want to put it, it feels like this was made with love by reality, in a sense. This was made with love. Like, it feels like, and I think that's one of the reasons why religions tend to go forth with a kind of language of love to describe the ultimate. Because you naturally associate the highest things with a feeling of made with love, which is your mom or parents made it with love. Therefore, it seems like when these highest experiences come forth, it was made with love. Likewise, great scripts. It feels like Shakespeare made all of his plays with love. It feels like great works of art are made with love, even if they're Kafka and they're tortured. That's what's weird. Even the tortured artist seems to make with love, right? So it's not love equals nice, but there's a certain quality of craft that we seem to struggle to capture in a term, but love is the one that's most at hand. And we go through life looking for things made with love by reality, in a sense. I could begin talking about C.S. Peirce, but he's infinite, and that would be dangerous because he is insane. You need to write that book. C.S. Peirce is freaking nuts. But let me give it to Mr. Rivera, and then Mr. Luber, and Mr. Rivera.
Well, I mean, it's interesting, Christian, when we're talking about like dispositions. I don't know. I'm pretty sure you'd call these positions, right? Like this idea of taking the position of the pessimist or the optimist. And it's funny because most people would consider those dispositions. Um, well, it's interesting because I've been thinking a lot about this discrepancy between optimism and pessimism, and there's always somebody advancing this argument, and they always come down to like, oh, it's an aesthetic difference, right? Whether you're an optimist or a pessimist, it's kind of aporia that can never be resolved. But what I find interesting is that when you change the scope, and what I mean is when you change the scope from a realism, because that's what both optimism and pessimism, for the most part, seem to kind of argue around. When you shift it to story, well, if we're all optimistic, kind of makes for uninteresting stories. And then, but if we're all pessimistic, well, we have no motivation, no goals. Also, it would make a boring story, actually. Nothing happens. So then you have this kind of moment of, well, hold on, where do they get their vigor from? And I would say it's tragedy. They are getting their life force. To me, both pessimism and optimism are a response to something within a story, which would be something like a tragedy or anything like that. And I feel like that's what's very important to understand, is that pessimism to me is lacking because it's a response to a tragedy. Whereas actually, perhaps if we were tragedists, maybe that would be a more accurate representation. But then we have to think about, what does a tragedist mean? How does a tragedist live? Well, I'm assuming you would come across this irony where you can't live as a tragedist because then tragedy would cease to exist. You have to sort of have yourself open to a surprise. And that's what I've noticed as a kind of denial of a bad actor, is that they deny surprise. A bad actor will deny surprise. So both optimism and pessimism, however we want to, all the varieties of forms of optimism, in my opinion, both kind of always tend to deny surprise in some ways. So it's funny that for me, I came to the conclusion of it's a bad actor. Now, what's interesting when you look at Much Ado About Nothing, and I think you'll find this play interesting with Shakespeare, Christian, is in Much Ado About Nothing, it's very funny because there's this suggestion by Shakespeare that I'm still trying to think through, which is this. We cannot be fooled by falling into love, which I think is interesting, because what happens in Much Ado About Nothing is Benedict and Beatrice are fooled by their friends through gossip about that the other likes them. Okay? So the other likes them or loves them. Now, I can imagine a situation where I hear somebody loves me, but that doesn't exactly fool me into loving them. I can be fooled into believing that this other person loves me, but I cannot be fooled into myself loving them, which is fascinating, actually. So both Beatrice and Benedict realize that they love each other through this kind of idea. Like, that's fascinating to me. But when you looked at Harrow and I forget the other guy's name, there's something fascinating about this. You can be fooled out of love because there was a kind of mockery and scene set up by Don John. Don John set up this scene where Harrow is seen as unchaste, and so the other character denies and no longer wants anything to do with her. So there is this kind of suggestion that we can be fooled out of love, which seems to be the danger, but we cannot be fooled into love, which I think is interesting. Now, I'm still trying to combat my second move, which is to say that we can be fooled out of love, because there's a sense in which, oh, that's his name, Claudio. Claudio is upset by being fooled out of love, but then it makes me wonder, well, if he's upset, was he actually fooled out of love? Does not his anger represent his love for Harrow? Is he necessarily fooled out of love? These are the questions that I'm left with Shakespeare that kind of felt like a real aporia, because the way that the play ends is with Benedict saying, well, I have concluded that man is a giddy thing. And giddiness seems to have this kind of funny, dizzy quality of enjoyment, but also it seems to be the very thing that determines whether we make it into a comedy or we make it into a tragedy. And you see this very clearly within Claudio and Harrow being the tragedy elements, and Benedict and Beatrice as the comedy elements. So those are just the sidebar of just what I thought was very fascinating when you start talking about aporios, Christian, something that I've been thinking through Shakespeare's Much Ado About Nothing, and not to mention that Shakespeare himself calls this title Much Ado About Nothing, which there seems to be something about deception that knows how to play with nothing. But yeah, I'll leave it there.
Well, that last first, that's very interesting. I'll give it to Luber and then Chloe. I appreciate everyone being here. I think this idea that you can not be fooled to fall in love, but can be fooled out of love. This seems extremely important because I do think that's pointing to a certain theological structure or structure of beauty. Like, you can't fake the experience of beauty, but you can forget it. Like this, there's something about what you're describing there makes me think of the remembering emphasis, the encounter, the strike of beauty, but then you can forget it or not emphasize it. And so you can fall out of, but the way we tend to fall out of is by a certain forgetting, a certain or forsaking, or did God really say in the garden kind of thing, right? So that's very interesting, and it does seem to point to a certain structure. And I think what you were saying about deception there is very, very interesting, because in a sense, acting presents this question of, will it be used for deception or will it be used to bring something forth, right? Like, there's a kind of ethical question with acting. Well, if you don't have a metaphysics, all acting can do is serve self-interest. I mean, even if you're doing Shakespeare, it's for your status or career or something, or because you like it. Like, for there to be some sort of possibility of acting affording something that is not, in a sense, at root deception, you require a metaphysic. And the last thing I'll say is I've been thinking as you've been speaking, like, acting, the possibility of good acting unveils if a metaphysic is good, because it unveils if a metaphysic entails the possibility of the negation of the negation. And a good metaphysics must entail a negation of the negation. And, you know, in the sense of, An actor is someone who's going to negate reality, we can say, right? This is not real. We're going to negate reality. We're going to act like it's real. But then the good actor negates the negation in that they treat it as real. They self-forget. They enter into the space. And this affords a certain quality of reality that is not possible otherwise, right? A sign of a bad metaphysic is there's no negation of the negation. Now, obviously, my Hegel bias is coming through, but the negation of the negation simply seems to be reality, because reality comes forth in a manner that is an error. It's not the whole, the truth is not the whole, the truth is the whole, the excess, blah, blah, blah. It comes forth as an error that has to be, and the error, the recognition that it's an error is a negation, but then you come to the point where you see the error is necessary. You negate the negation. And that actually then opens you up to the aporia, because an aporia is a negation of the negation. Like you say, I need to be uncertain precisely to know the one thing I can know, which is that I am uncertain. Negation of the negation, boom, different quality of interaction, right? So acting, I think it is very nice. I think it's very true that good acting becomes a very useful test for the possibility of a good metaphysics, because a good metaphysics requires the possibility of a negation of the negation. But I will pause and I will give it to Mr. Luber. Mr. Luber, please.
Like I was saying in the comments, like to get into that story mode, you have to really care about other people, basically. And then only to find that at the end of caring about them, it was because it was for yourself. That's the irony, where most people think about how this benefits me as the initial part of any kind of encounter, and like whether it benefits you is what will dictate the encounter. And it's impossible to get into the story mode, because the story mode is something other than you that opens you up into self-discovering yourself, which is basically at the end of every story, the change that has occurred. Oh, now I learned this because I've encountered this journey that I was not expecting to go on, because I was thrown into a situation that is completely other to me. Like the situation was there before I had this understanding of who I am. It was in the exposition of any story. It's establishes basically the normalcy of what the story is, and in that sense, there's no way of knowing what is going to be incited upon you, besides that it's something that is being concealed within the exposition itself. And since it's concealed, there's no way of actually knowing. So like, just to give an example of how like we're just so far away from this mindset. The famous, I wrote this down just as an example, absolute power corrupts absolutely. That's a very famous quote. But in actuality, when you think about if reality is actually structured like a story, and it's actually back to the corrupt. And in that sense, that initial attraction is that other dimension. You're attracted to something other than you. So then once you're attracted to it, you're brought into that thing. And then the journey of understanding why you were brought into that thing is basically discovering the I, like why I am attracted to it. It's not that you are attracted to it initially, and that's why you were drawn to it. No, it's just that other thing is pulling you in. You have no say. Like that's the whole point. And that's very scary. So with like a lot of writers, especially in Hollywood, they're not writing stories for others. They're writing stories for themselves. So what ends up happening is what they're attracted to, it's because they're saying, I'm attracted to this, and therefore I'm doing that. But they don't stumble upon it. There's no importing oneself in a way that just allows for them to get strung along something that is other to them, other to what they initially think their desire is. And then being pulled in, if you are comported in that way, you're surprised by what you actually do desire. And in the creative act, if you really take that type of comportment seriously, you will be surprised a lot. Like not just once, not just twice, like continuously. And through things going wrong, through encountering what other people want that have more power than you in the situation. So like, you know, for example, Alex is editing. Like he's the main editor. What he wants, I don't know. He shows me, and then he has more power than me. It's both our thing, but the psychotic move is I'm holding myself in a way that I'm allowing what the other wants to take priority first, and in that I discover what I really want in actually executing on that idea. It's both our ideas, but how they initially want to execute it is from the person that has more power. So like I just wanted to kind of talk about Foucault for a second, because this is also where power gets all fucked up, where it's like, oh yeah, power is what moves the situation. No, power is what moves the situation initially. That's the initial attractor, but that is not what the end result of the process. The initial attractor isn't the through line of the entire process. That's something completely other to the initial attractor and you, which is something I would call the theme. And that's something you have to kind of continuously encounter and tarry with through through a twofold memory. And then in that process, you then discovering your own desire that then makes sense and fits. There's a certain fitting that fits within that unfolding that initially started with someone that has more power than you, or something that has more power than you. So you have that twofold thing where it's the initial power that starts the unfolding, and then your own desire that fits within that unfolding, and then having to go back and forth between what's fitting for you within that unfolding and that initial power that created the unfolding in the first place, and kind of bouncing back and forth between those two. Now you're operating within the thematic realm, because now there's this backdrop. You could call it a power if you will, but this backdrop attractor that isn't the power, the tangible power for the tangible power variable in the unfolding, and it's not your own personal desire that fits within that tangible power in the unfolding. So it's this very weird place where you can only get there after basically encountering that initial power and then encountering your own desire, the discovery of your own desire within that power structure that creates the initial unfolding. So that's why it's we could say we're entering the world, the thematic dimension now in the world, because we've now established a certain power structure that has existed long enough that we can understand that, okay, this power structure is what's creating the unfolding in which we're situated in. And then we also have the self-awareness to understand what we desire in understanding this structure's unfolding. It's like, oh, well, I don't want to use my phone like that. But like, I understand that capitalism has a certain relationship with technology that at a certain point it becomes inevitable that I have to use some kind of cellular device. So there's a certain mediation between those two tensions. And then in thinking about that mediation, that's when you're thinking thematically. And it's only after those two parts have happened. And then here's the crazy move at the end. and this is where faith comes in. And Daniel, you really brought this point home for me, which is the theme is actually what started it all in the first place. But that is a complete choice, an absolute choice, a choice of faith, and it can only be realized only after the realization of, in this example, the power structure, and then your own personal desire that's fitting within the unfolding of that power structure. And in that sense, once you get to that place, you are now a storyteller, because you can then craft and engineer your reality in an actual serious way, because you're able to have a certain mediation between your own personal desire that's situated within the power that created the initial unfolding of where you find your desire to be currently at. I said a lot there, but I just kind of wanted to recap. Basically, where, in my opinion, the position of the storyteller is in all this, and how actually complex it is. But like once you like getting there is complex, but once you realize it's actually very simple, it becomes very simple. And in a certain sense, we're blessed that we're in a time that it can be presented in a very simple way, because it's like, oh, well, what power structure are we operating under? No brainer, capitalism. Like there's certain no brainer things to that answer, but actually getting to that place was very difficult and very arduous. There was a lot of, you know, peaks and valleys, and getting to a place where, yeah, the dollar, capitalism is running the world completely now. But yeah, I'll pass it off.
Yeah, well, for me, capital is basically the logic of autonomous rationality that started ever since evolution went in the direction of apes instead of dolphins. Then through the Enlightenment, and now we're at AI, and basically you have the AI causer that is forcing the absolute choice. Because also when you talk about the I going through other, that is lack is not nothing. The other is not nothing. If you say lack is nothing, then it's just I. There is no other to go through back to yourself. And so the identification of lack as a present absence and metaphysically rich and aporia, apophatic, etc., so forth, is what our moment requires. Because where everything is systemized, where everything is computerized, then you have to choose the opposite of everything is nothing. And if everything is under the control of AI, you either have to choose for that nothing to really be nothing or lack. And if it's lack, there's a reality in the lack. And that is where the map is not the territory, unfolds the girdle point for the entire world. Basically, the AI is the girdle point of the world. Because it is the causer in the sense of it affords the possibility of the encounter of the point of incompletion precisely in the completion of the internal consistent system of the logic of autonomous rationality, dolphin evolution, in the form of AI. Well, the choice to return to dolphin evolution, which would be the end of us. Now that's that loaded idea from 100 net ago, but that's really important for me, or Wilson for me. I think so. Yeah, basically, AI is the girdle point. It's the encounter with the girdle point that forces us to choose. There is no girdle point, or the very completeness means there is a girdle point, which is the final absolute choice between lack is nothing or lack is not nothing, which. Again, if AI captures everything, all that's left is nothing. So the quality of that nothing really matters. Is it a lack or is it a nothing? And that's what we have to choose, because we experience both the same way. What I would also say before I forget, I love what you were saying on the power structure. I think I also must do about nothingness. That's exactly right. I think also there's that idea where the I has to be at the end of the story, because really we learn of ourselves through a kind of phenomenological method, which is to say, I was attracted to X and I did X. So what? And then at the end you go, I did X. So what kind of being must I be to do X? Now I know what I am. Until you go to the end, you don't have the ability to ask what kind of being would go after that thing. So you can't know what you are. Or all you can say is, I'm myself, which is an empty tautology. But when you go on the story, you can say, I am the one who went on that story. And thus was motivated by that, which in a real sense, you don't know who you are until you know your desire. But you can't know your desire without a story, other than just whatever the power structure presents you with. And you could say it that way. Basically, desire has been mostly overdetermined until this point of history by, well, commodity, by the power structure, right? Well, as the power structure is reaching the AI causer, that begs the question of, well, what is desire exactly? What is it exactly? And then you go on that quest. And of course, following Dante and all the classics, desire is the window into metaphysics. When you start asking, where does attraction come from? Where do movement come from? Then it's begging, what is the case to afford such movement and attraction? And I think what I would also say is, I'm glad you brought in the storyteller. For me, I find that great storytellers, oddly, are also kind of actors. They have a certain sort of, they act the story as they write it. They think in it, they enter it, they become it, right? And so there's a way in which this age of the storyteller indeed is kind of the age of the actor, because great actors become kind of story writers, and great story writers act out their story. So the line kind of, in my opinion, collapses at this moment of the absolute calls, of the absolute choice. So storytelling is afforded. So basically, at this moment where the power, and then I'll close, and thank you all for being here, and thank you, Michael, for coming back. Alas, I have to run for dinner, but I appreciate you coming back. But it's this idea that in the power structure unveiling itself, it affords to us the question of becoming storytellers, which we can only become storyteller if we take seriously the philosophy of acting and the phenomenology of the artist, and that recalibrates our metaphoric substrate, to use that, C Money will use. And y'all have got to meet C Money. I really like him. But anyway, storytelling has a lot to do with being an actor, and great actors and great storytellers become their story, which is precisely the mode of subjectivity, the saturation of the power structure, I think, affords us at the absolute calls. But thank you all.